This is a place that few of us that aren't serious bird watchers or naturalists will ever visit. It's a land that's really outside the realm of understanding for most of us Americans. But this place is packed with biodiversity. Many of the plants and animals that are found here can be found nowhere else in the United States. This is a land of green jays and plain chachalakas. Join me on today's expedition as we explore a hint of the tropics here in South Texas.
You may be surprised, but birding is big business. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it generates over $40 billion a year. South Texas attracts tens of thousands of birders and natural history enthusiasts each year. The reason is the connection to points south, Mexico. The border region is in the news continuously these days as the debate over immigration continues. It turns out, however, that people may not be the only species moving north in search of better opportunities.
You would never expect in the United States to see 4 or 5 species of parrot just completely covering trees. But we came here to this park in Brownsville specifically to see the roosting of these birds. Huge numbers of red-crowned parrots, red-lored parrots, yellow-headed parrots. Not too many years ago, there was a pretty dramatic freeze in southeast Texas. And when that happened, a lot of these Washingtonia palms died. And when they died, woodpeckers came and made nests. And these amazingly raucous birds pair up and make their nest in the holes that are made by woodpeckers. And there's a good suspicion that some of these species, like these red-crowned parrots and the green parakeets, actually moved themselves from Mexico when all this great nesting habitat showed up. And look at that. Even more parrots coming in to this roost. And it's a great example of how changes humans have made here in the landscape have actually been taken advantage of by some of the most amazing species of wildlife and the ones that really make you think we are in the tropics.
South Texas is a highly fragmented landscape. One of the most interesting and best remaining subtropical habitats left is nearby. But much to our surprise, to reach the preserve, you have to cross the wall.
Well, sometimes when we're preparing a shot or we come to an area and sort of scope it out to figure out what we're going to talk about, we're confronted with things that we just can't ignore. We've talked about the border fence in programs before, but until you really step up to it, you don't really get it.
You can hear about it on the news for years, you can read articles about it, you can even see pictures, but until you're face to face with it, it takes your breath away. It's bigger than I could have imagined. It looks so drastically different from the habitat that we're in.
Yeah, and the amazing thing here, this fence is in the American side of the border, and the place we're headed to, Sable Palm Preserve, is actually on the other side of the fence.
Yeah.
It's been fenced out of the United States. But you have to wonder how some wildlife get through this, and this is a barrier for wildlife moving back and forth. Discontinuous through Texas, but this thing is planned to run continuously from here all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so we don't know. We're doing things without knowing. It's
we
great.
Don't know what it's going to affect.
It's the American way. You probably don't associate a really lush forest like this one with your idea of Texas, but we're in Texas, and this is a great example of a little chunk of tropical forest right here along the lower Rio Grande Valley, and it provides habitat for a lot of species that you can find in no other habitat in the United States. And this is Sable Palm Sanctuary, named for the palms, and these are called Mexican palmetto, but here in Texas they like to call them Texas palmetto. The grove that we're standing in is about 30 acres. And we're looking at what is almost half of all the remaining native Texas palmettos left. Only 50, 60 years ago, there was upwards of 60,000 acres of palm forest like this. And today, due to agricultural conversion and other conversions of the land, it's now down to a mere 60 acres. This grove is probably the best known, and along with the grove that's owned by the Nature Conservancy, that represents all of the sable palm forest that's left in the United States. A lot of species are limited to these moist forests. One of the ones that's pretty common here is the speckled racer. It's an incredibly beautiful multicolored snake that you find here in the understory Even the cactus that's here, one of my favorite cacti. In Texas, they call it barbed wire cactus. And it's not hard to see why. You don't want to walk into this stuff with all of these thorns coming out in these areoles. And when you look at this cactus, look at those stems that bend over just like a pile of barbed wire. It's mostly confined to these moist forests, especially sable palm groves. And today, not much of that habitat left, and this species is suffering here in Texas as a result as well. Incredible place because it truly is a little chunk of tropical forest that's stuck down here in the lower Rio Grande Valley. And in this forest, we still find abundant wildlife. Some of the most incredible tropical birds that barely make it into our country.
The green jay is emblematic of the region and one of the most commonly seen birds here. It's among the most colorful and attractive birds on the planet. You don't have to look hard to find great birds here at the preserve. In fact, the feeder is a great place to start.
Well, we've had an incredible morning here just watching backyard birds. Birds at a bird feeder here at the Audubon Sable Palm Sanctuary. And to see backyard birds here is a little different than the backyard birds we see at home. And actually this place is very different because it's surrounded by some really great natural habitat. And we've seen northern cardinals, gray catbirds, even Carolina wrens around this feeder. But we're seeing a lot of other stuff too.
We're seeing what we'd like to call an ecological equivalent or replacement for those birds that we would see in our backyard. So they fill the same niche, and sometimes they even look very similar, like the black-crested titmouse.
Which is a really common bird here, very similar to the tufted titmouse we see at home. It has that beautiful black crest.
And we've seen the white-tipped doves here, which are like the mourning doves that we would recognize in your neighborhood.
Right, and we do have some mourning doves here in this part of Texas, but these guys are really easy to recognize, but only if you're really close to it. That white tip to the tail.
You can get close enough to see, give it away.
Feeders are great places to see those birds, and other birds too. We've seen long-billed thrashers, which is essentially replacing the brown thrasher that we have at home. And we have specialist sparrows, the olive sparrow, one that really only pushes into the United States right here along the lower Rio Grande Valley.
In South Texas.
Yeah, even one of the rarest robins that we have in the United States, but very common in the tropics, the clay-colored thrush or clay-colored robin.
Seen a lot in Costa Rica, and it's actually the national bird of Costa Rica.
Yeah, absolutely is. You can really see that strong tropical connection. But also, given that tropical connection, you expect things that we see in our backyards at home in the summertime to come here to spend the winter, and that's the case. We've seen just today the yellow-throated warbler.
Right, getting right up close to us. They're on the feeders, they're on the tree branches, and when you get a chance to see the bright yellow feathers, and it's gorgeous.
And the few will winter as far north as the Carolinas, but really this is home for them.
This is home.
Yeah, they've been joined by things like orange-crowned warblers, and of course the old butterbutt, the old yellow-rumped warbler. Attracted to suet, and even the woodpecker community here. We have seen one that's come all the way down to the feeders, and that's the golden-fronted woodpecker. It's a very close relative of the red-bellied woodpecker. The golden-fronted is actually taking that role that the red-bellied does, replacing it as we move down into southern Texas and into Mexico, and just a gorgeous bird. One warbler that we've seen down here skulking along the ground with his tail up is the ovenbird. That's not a bird that we usually see in scrubby open sites like we're in here. It's a bird at home that we think of being in large tracts of older growth forest. But just like a lot of these birds on the wintering range, they can switch up and use
They change up their behaviors, in their habitats. It's fun to come to a new habitat for you and see some trees you don't recognize, but then see animals that you do.
Right.
And so it makes you feel at home, but then also in the tropics as well.
Yeah, and I think that familiarity is great here in South Texas because we do see a lot of these replacement species. You may not know them when you see them, but they're pretty easy to find in the bird book because you know something that looks pretty similar.
This is a land of extremes. You can leave a moist subtropical palm forest and in a matter of only minutes, be back in Cactus Country.
Here in South Texas, you can move from a lush forest full of palms into an area that looks like this in just a matter of feet. And this is one of the coolest places I've seen for cacti. One of my favorites is right here, Mammillaria hateri. A lot of times it's called Hader's pincushion cactus or Hader's nipple cactus. It's not just flowering right now, but it's fruiting. These little fruits are produced almost like a little package. They're out away from the spine so that they can be easily taken out by birds, mammals, other things that would want to get at that fruit. Red fruits attract birds. So birds come in, pick them up, eat them, carry them away, and drop the seeds. Birds aren't the only things that like these fruits. I like them too. Excellent fruit on these species and have been very important as a food for indigenous people for many, many hundreds of years. And it's not just this species that produces a lot of fruit. The one that's all around me, that's the aspect dominant, the thing you notice here is this enormous species called tall Texas prickly pear. The fruits of this plant, just like the little Hayter's pincushion cactus, are also edible. And these fruits will stain your mouth, bright purple, but they're delicious. Sweet little fruits, tart, almost flavored like strawberries. Now this forest, as dry and as desert-like as it seems, has something really weird also going on in it, because South Texas isn't quite as dry as Southwest Texas. It's not a desert. And there's snail shells everywhere here. These are actually tree snails. They live up here in the mesquite trees. And this is the reason why we're in this little patch of thorn scrub, because this little patch of thorn scrub has lately been home to one of the coolest raptors in North America, and is here for the snails. Talk about a bird that barely makes it in the United States and it's not consistently here. Those are hook-billed kites. Doesn't look much like the other kites that we're familiar with in the United States, and it is a tropical bird. A hook-billed kite will feed on a tree full of snails, walking along the branches till every single snail on that tree is consumed. And you can tell where a hook-billed kite's been working simply by looking at the base of the tree. It's littered with piles of dead snails. And hook-billed kites, all the way from way down in the neotropics to here, have separate populations that are tied to the size and the shape and the biology of the snails that they eat. So this one has one of the most massive, powerful hooked bills of any population of hook-billed kites, because they're out here grabbing and crushing these great big white tree snails, getting in there and getting at the soft meat inside. So you have to live in a place where you have snails out in the trees to have an animal like this. And so you have to come here to find them. Distinctively unkite-like. We think about swallowtail kites, up hovering. Same with the Mississippi kite. This guy, not really that closely related to him, still a kite. But this one, always skulking along, working its way through trees, picking through branches after snails. Incredible bird, a huge kite, very unkite-like, and wow.
It doesn't take long to realize just how little of any kind of natural habitat still exists in South Texas. Even the thorn scrub here is 95% gone. Forests are even rarer. One of my favorite places to explore this habitat is Benson Rio Grande Valley State Park. Tropical plants here work hard to prevent being eaten. They employ spines and even poisons. Leaves here contain lots of secondary compounds to keep herbivores from eating them. But one animal has found a unique way around this dilemma.
When you think about tropics, you think about ants. And in the neotropics, it's leafcutter ants that are really an engine that moves the forest. These amazing ants have found a really unique way to get around those nasty secondary compounds, things like tannins and cyanogenic glycosides that are in these leaves. All of these leaves that these worker ants are taking off of the trees around here are being carried hundreds of feet along a green trail back to a burrow that connects up with the main mounds of this particular colony of Texas leafcutter ant. And in that mound, they're growing fungus. And that fungus is having to deal with those secondary compounds. And as it grows the fungus, it's growing food for itself, because these ants eat only the fungus, not the leaves. So a really ingenious way to get around all of the toxins that these plants are providing in their leaves to protect them against just this, getting picked apart and carried away. Texas leafcutter ants are the northernmost species of leafcutter ant, and these ants have extraordinarily complex social systems. All of these ants are sisters. There are no males currently in this colony, and the colony may have 1 million or more individuals in it. Their mounds can be immense and can look almost like a prairie dog town. One of the common names for this ant in Texas is actually the town ant, because of the mounds that it makes. And you see lots of different size classes of ants along this trail. And those little ones aren't going to grow up to be the big ones. The largest of these ants that are out here along patrolling this trail are what we call soldiers. They have a great big thick head, and their main job is to protect trails from things like me, something that's going to go in and disturb the trail. There's smaller ants that are only slightly smaller, still with big, powerful heads and long legs, and those are the worker ants. Those are out here cutting the leaves, and they're basically the lumberjacks in this social system. And then all through this trail are little tiny ants, and those are keeping the trail clean, helping to move some of the smaller leaves, but it's a different size worker. And if we go back to the nest itself, you'll see those small ants are also responsible for cleaning the mound, caring for the fungus, and building and moving around the soil inside that mound. And then, of course, deep down inside the mound is the queen, who's laid all the eggs, one queen, for all up to 1 million ants that are in this colony. Another really interesting thing about this ant is that its northern limit isn't determined by the climate that the ant itself can tolerate. It's determined by the climate that the fungus can tolerate. And that fungus is a tropical fungus. So where they can't keep that mound really nice and warm, even in the wintertime, determines how far north they can go. An incredible little farmer, really a Texas specialty, and you see the most of them right here in the Lower Rio Grande Valley. Well, we've had a couple more green jays and some beautiful Altamira orioles come into this feeder, but the real reason that I'm here is because of a very plain colored bird, the Plain Chachalaka. It's an incredible chicken-sized bird. It looks like a little turkey. It's the northernmost member of the guan family and essentially replaces turkeys and pheasant-type birds down in the tropics. But in the tropics, this bird, just like turkeys here in North America, has been heavily hunted traditionally. And so when you visit the tropics, finding guans is really tough where people are still hunting. The Plain Chachalaka is lucky because it does push into the United States, and it's a bird that's doing really well over large parts of its range. It has been decimated in others because of hunting. But in places like this, they're everywhere, and they've learned to adapt to people, and they really had to. Not much of this habitat left. So the Plain Chachalaka, they travel around in large family groups, and they'll congregate up in bushes and trees, and they'll start singing the song for which they received their name. It's just, that call is a loud, raucousing Chachalaka, Chachalaka, Chachalaka. To me, when I hear that in South Texas, it transports me to Belize because I'm so used to hearing that sound in the tropics. The Chachalaka's real challenge is the amount of habitat it has left. They're very well adapted to living around people, and they'll even live in neighborhoods, but they like cover. And with 95% of the Tamaulipa and Thorn Scrub gone, Chachalakas are really limited to small populations in these small parks and sections of wildlife refuges. And really tying together this whole lower Rio Grande Valley area is super important for keeping the really charismatic and the really characteristic tropical species of birds and wildlife that depend on South Texas for their existence here in the United States. They may be plain, but to me, the comical and incredibly cool looking Plain Chachalakas, they transport me right back to the tropics.
Do you still need more convincing that the connection to Mexico is what makes this place important? Well, perhaps the most surprising of all the inhabitants here makes its home in one of the toughest of habitats.
Well, this incredibly thick habitat is called the Thorn Scrub, and with good reason. Absolutely everything's covered with spines and thorns, and it's incredibly thick too. But this habitat happens to be the preferred habitat for one of the most charismatic creatures in all of North America.
We arrive at Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge to visit with Hillary Swartz, who is monitoring the endangered ocelot population of South Texas.
So this is one of the guzzlers that we established for the tough drought conditions that the ocelots face. And since 2010, that was a wet year, and then it had been dry.
Right.
All the water around has been dried up. So in that might be a limiting factor.
Right.
These guzzlers help by providing a water source year-round, permanent.
Guzzler, that's a great name.
So
basically just a little bird bath for
It's
an
basically
ocelot.
a bird bath, right? And it's fed by a rain-filled cistern that's over there, which luckily is a big enough tank that even in dry times.
So you're catching the
rain,
rainwater.
It comes down.
Yep.
Collects in there, and it stays automatically filled to about this level. And not just the ocelots use it, We have armadillos in here, snakes in here, raccoons in here. The fencing around is to prevent the hogs from coming in, because the hogs will really, with the mud and everything, they'll just tear it up. So the hog fencing got put in to prevent that.
And so, given that you've got this limited resource, you know that ocelots are going to use it.
Yeah.
So it makes a perfect place to throw out a game cam. And hopefully you're going to get a shot from over here that shows.
Yeah, it's a perfect situation because it's super limited resource. It's almost like a funnel to get them in, and then they're standing there. The camera's coming right on them, and each of their spot patterns is unique. So kind of like a human fingerprint, we use the patterns with a key that we have of all the identified ocelots to say, oh, okay, like ocelot male 270 is there because we know he has a little butterfly shape on his right side, and oh look, the picture matches up with what we have. So. We use that in our censusing and monitoring to keep track of how many are here.
So the camera really is the way to remotely census the population here.
Totally uninvasive.
Uninvasive,
yeah. We have them all over the refuge in places that we know there's ocelot activity.
Right.
And a lot of times we'll actually have a camera on both sides because the sides aren't symmetrical.
Right.
So we want to be able to say, and surprisingly enough, they don't behave and stand there and go like this for you. Sometimes you just get the tail or a haunch or something, so you're trying to kind of use that key to match up. So the more info you have, the better able you're going to be to identify that one where there's like a teeny little piece of it heading off into the brush. And we use those pictures. They're collected about once a month, go through, do we have who we have where we think they are?
Yeah.
And then they're also really good because they help us strategize for trapping. So it's like, oh, okay, we know this individual comes here frequently. If we want to trap for that individual, let's put our traps in this area. And then we do the trapping so that we can collar them and either use radio telemetry or GPS collars that shoot the locations up.
And it's just another example of the lower Rio Grande Valley providing a refuge for yet another population, formerly more widespread today. This is its last stronghold, and with 95% of this habitat cleared, it's a tough job.
And they're a natural predator in the area. I think that's something that, especially in North America, we forget the value of the predator in the ecosystem overall. And when we're, everybody's freaking out, oh, we're overrun with deer, oh, we're overrun with rabbits, and but let's make sure we don't have any coyotes. Let's make sure we don't have any ocelots. Let's make sure we don't have anything that would take care of them. Whether or not it's realistic to sort of think you're going to assume the natural order again, which is always a kind of an elusive prospect, having a predator in your system is healthy for your system overall.
Why do you care about ocelots?
I think they have, it's corny. They're beautiful. They're drop dead gorgeous. They're strong, they're graceful, they're solitary, and they're elusive, which make them really hard to study, but I think make them really mysterious and interesting for people too. And I guess it's the unexpected aspect. It's like, oh my gosh, that's here? Like, that's amazing. You don't expect it to be here. And I've gotten to work in places where, these sort of more exotic animals are expected, and it doesn't make them any less cool. But to kind of see this in South Texas, it makes you really want it to stay. It really makes you want to conserve.
Most of the astounding wildlife here is much more obvious. It's in your face. And watching what professionals do to attract them can be helpful at home.
Here at Benson Rio Grande Valley State Park, some of the most beautiful birds are not necessarily attracted to seeds. A few of the most beautiful ones are actually attracted to fruits, and you can actually attract some of the most beautiful songbirds right into your own backyard by offering them fruit in a fruit feeder just like this one. All you really need is a feeder with a couple of pegs on there that you can slide an orange slice into, or even apples. And different birds come to fruit feeders than come to seed feeders. And you may have to have them up for a while, but eventually they're going to find them. And one of my favorite birds that come to these feeders are orioles. Orioles like you've seen nowhere else, because here in South Texas, we have Altamira orioles. They're the most vibrant orange you can imagine, and they're one of the largest orioles in North America. They're huge, like a Baltimore oriole, but much bigger. These birds are the orangest of orange birds that I know of anywhere in the world. Incredible to see them coming up to fruit feeders here. Well, the Altamira oriole, it's related to blackbirds. A lot of people don't realize that orioles are in the blackbird family. And I was lucky enough to have Javier the assistant director here, give me one of these nests. Have a look at that thing. I mean, you think about bird nests, you usually don't think about a great big hollow sack like this that you're going to raise your young in. And the Altamira oriole builds one of these every single year. It looks like it's just constructed out of strips of grass, but it's not. Each one of these little fibers that's in here is a piece of bark that's been stripped off of a young piece of wood and woven together into this intricate nest that down at the bottom is going to hold the eggs, the young, and they're going to fledge right out of the top. And then it's abandoned and they start the process all over the next year. Another incredibly beautiful bird that's a flycatcher. Great kiskadees have been coming to these feeders all day. Great kiskadees are generalists. It's one of the reasons why they're so awfully successful in the tropics. Along the edges of forests, in backyards, in open areas, in scrubby areas, and in mature forests, all throughout the neotropics. But in the United States, they push up just to here. We think that black across the eye is actually to reduce glare when they are actually fly catching. But this bird, being a generalist, takes everything from fruit to flies. Incredible place to see that diversity that pushes up from Mexico and learn something you can do at home. Baltimore Orioles will come to a feeder just like that one.
The importance of the connection to the South for maintaining the biodiversity of this region of America is obvious. The special species of wildlife here are stunning. Join us next time as we explore the vital connection that South Texas plays to the biodiversity of the rest of this great country. South Texas, the border region. How important is this place to the ebb and flow of life in the United States? How is the wildlife in your state dependent on what happens here? Join me on today's expedition as we explore the connections to your backyard here on the border. South Texas is both a unique place where tropical connections exist and a land that's incredibly important to the conservation of our natural heritage, no matter where you live in the United States. We begin our morning moving from South Padre Island towards one of the coolest habitats in South Texas. But on the way, we have to stop and marvel at a spectacle of birds.
What a great way to wake up and start the day. It's raw out here. I mean, it's really cold, just barely above freezing. The wind's whipping around, it's blowing rain, but these birds have hunkered down in this little wet pocket here in the salt marsh. And if I didn't know better, I'd think I was down in South Florida, because this is the kind of scene we associate with places like Sanibel Island. But here we are, South Padre Island, southernmost Texas, and we're encountering roseate spoonbills with that big spoon-shaped bill made to sweep back and forth in the shallow, muddy water and snatch up little invertebrates, the pink coloration largely caused from the little crustaceans that they depend on for food. And you look at the birds that are in here, we've got spoonbills, we've got reddish egrets, two beautiful males that we've been watching here, all decked out in that beautiful long breeding plumage. Look at that crest on that bird. You see, here in South Texas, we see the typical phase, the reddish phase of the reddish egret, but we also have this beautiful pure white phase, and they're accompanied by white ibis, great egrets, snowy egrets, great blue herons, and we see lots and lots of shorebirds too. A bunch of yellow legs, and one of my favorite shorebirds in this part of Texas, what I think is the most smartly patterned and sharp-looking shorebird in North America, the black-necked stilt. And that's a bird that you can find all times of year here in South Texas, but they're always seeming to be on the move. It's migratory. It's amazing to get this close to this many birds. Most people don't think about South Texas as being great wading bird habitat if you haven't been here. But this place, equally as good as the best sites in Florida.
Only minutes away, and we enter a landscape that is very familiar looking to me, but not one I'd expect to see on the Texas coastline.
I love open, windy, spacious places, and this is one of them. This is an incredibly rare habitat. In fact, this is probably the rarest natural community in Texas, maybe one of the rarest in the world. I'm standing in the middle of what we call a southern Gulf coastal prairie. And this habitat, down to 1% of its total former acreage. And almost all of that 1% that remains is right here at Bahia Grande, part of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge. And if you close your eyes actually here and just feel the wind and the cold and listen to the sounds of the birds that are around us, you're almost transported to places like South Dakota or Oklahoma, because around us are singing things like horned larks, lark buntings, and eastern meadow larks, the same species we associate with prairie habitats much farther to the north. This prairie habitat does have a lot of grass, a lot of sedge component to it, but also a lot of salt marsh components because we're close to the ocean. It's not terribly dry here in southeastern Texas, but it's dry enough and saline enough here that we have a lot of drought specialist species. So in this part of Texas, you can ride through miles of habitat like this that is dominated by these huge succulents. Things like the Spanish dagger yucca or Don Quixote's lace. And I love that name because it refers to the beautiful flowers. And this plant flowers in the wintertime or early spring. So right now, as you drive down the road, we see these beautiful creamy white flowers on these yuccas. But it's not just yuccas that occur in this habitat. There's a lot of cacti, species that you'd typically think of being in true desert. Things that look like pincushion, hedgehog cactus, and tiny little barrel cactus here growing among salt marsh plants. Now, one of the reasons that this area is grassy instead of turning into scrubby habitats is because it depends on fire. That's the ecological process that keeps prairie-like habitat like this prairie. On the wildlife refuge, there's huge areas that are burned using controlled burns to maintain this incredibly rare community. Laguna Atascosa contains almost all of the coastal prairie that's left, and it's the most reliable place to find one of the most beautiful raptors in North America. I don't know how we get so lucky when we're filming expeditions, but we usually find exactly what we're looking for. And it's something that you just can't come out here and see in general. And that's what we're doing here. Aplamata falcons. And we've been watching these falcons for several minutes now. And this is a bird that is only here in the United States, just right along the Mexican border. And in fact, it may have even disappeared from here before massive conservation efforts brought it back. And barely did we get in the gate when we spotted these guys just sitting there, a male and a female. Aplamata falcons love this habitat, broad open prairie. They love open areas for hunting. It's a falcon that acts a lot more like a raptor, like a hawk. It spends most of its time perched, looking for prey. And it's not just taking birds, although they take a lot of meadowlarks and grackles that are out here feeding. Much of their prey are also things like insects, lizards, snakes, reptiles, and small mammals. Aplamata falcons were almost gone in the 1980s when we started reintroduction efforts here. Aplamata falcons have done very well in Central America, where we've been clearing rainforest. We've actually been creating habitat for them, because as you clear rainforest and put it into cattle pasture and open habitat that simulate these prairies, you're adding habitat for Aplamata falcons. But here on the northern end of the range, they need this natural habitat to do well. The goal here in South Texas is to establish 35 breeding pairs. And to date, they've released well over 450 birds, mostly on Padre Island. And they continually seem to fly over here to places that are really their prime habitat, these wide open areas like this. And what a morning, getting to see one of the most beautiful falcons, a true South Texas specialty.
This place is called Bahia Grande for a reason, and we finally make it to the shallow body of water that gives this tract its name. And here we find one of the largest flying birds on the planet.
If your idea of a pelican is the brown pelican, you'll be shocked when you get a good close look at the American white pelican. You'll notice some big differences right away between this pelican and the brown pelican. Number one, they're white, but secondly, they're huge. Wingspans on these things can be 9 feet wide. These birds can weigh over 15 pounds. And when you see them flying over, it's like a bunch of bombers coming in. Another difference that we notice with white pelicans is the way in which they feed. Brown pelicans dive bomb for their food, come crashing into the water after small fish. This bird feeds cooperatively in groups, just slowly herding fish while they're swimming into tight concentrations and then dipping their bills into the water, scooping up those fish. You'll notice that some of these birds have a strange looking crest on the beak, And that crest is a breeding protuberance that rises on the end of the bill there. And it actually falls off after the breeding season. Well, another thing about American white pelicans is they're long-distance migrants. And this is a bird that was doing very poorly just a few short years ago. Today, it's made a pretty rapid rebound. And that's in large part due to the fact that we've started to keep people away from the breeding areas. You see, white pelicans are really sensitive to disturbance. So on the breeding areas, which in general in this species are way up in the Midwest, way up in places like North Dakota, Minnesota, southern Canada, they breed on little islands out in the middle of large lakes or even smaller lakes out in the prairies, away from disturbance. If people go out to those islands, people disturb those pelicans, they'll just abandon the site. Today, in protected places like this, we're seeing a resurgence in both the winter population and the breeding population. And just like a lot of other species here, this one, even though most of the population is long distance migrant, some populations here in Texas decide to stay, they decide to breed here, and you can find white pelicans somewhere along the Texas coast all year long.
The prairies, salt marshes, and wetlands are tightly connected to the life found across the continent. The most poignant example is the waterfowl.
These salt marshes and brackish marshes along the Texas coast are incredibly productive wetlands, providing a critical home to millions of migratory waterfowl along the Central Flyway. And we've been watching a ton of them right here. Behind me, we've had baldpates, my old favorite name for the American widgeon, this beautiful bird with a bright green sheen on the head and a bright white cap. And that's why it's given the name baldpate a lot of times by old hunters. And also even mergansers out here, a few pintails and even some lesser scaup. But by far, the bird that outnumbers all others out here in these estuaries and bays are these guys right here, redheads. One of the most handsome ducks in North America with that beautiful, glossy, russet-colored head and that beautifully sharply contrasting blue and black bill. The redhead looks very similar to a canvasback, but has a nice brown, rounded head instead of having that sloping forehead that we see on canvasbacks. The vast majority of all redheads in North America winter right here along the Texas coast, and it's one of a couple species that are really Texas specialists. We're seeing flocks that number in the thousands. These birds pair up here on the wintering grounds, and that's one of the reasons why all of these waterfowl are decked out in full breeding plumage here in the wintertime, is they actually form their pair bonds here. And so they choose their mates here, they fly up to their breeding homes, which is up in the prairie potholes and even up into Canada. And when they get there, they're already paired up. They don't have to waste time finding mates. The short breeding season is ready to go right on the spot. And redheads are a little unusual for most ducks in that they practice something called brood parasitism. Brood parasitism is laying your eggs in somebody else's nest, letting somebody else have the job of incubating and taking care of your young. Now, they don't have to do that. Redheads have the choice of either raising their own young, which a lot of them do, laying your eggs in a nest of another redhead, or, unique for them, laying their eggs in the nest of another duck species. Incredible to see flocks that number into the thousands, maybe tens of thousands, wintering in a great place, South Texas.
It's not only the northern ducks that call this place home. To find one of the most charismatic, you don't even have to leave town.
Well, I wanted to see black-bellied whistling ducks in Texas, and I think we did. We've got an enormous flock here at an urban park, really, right in Harlingen, Texas. And not only are there black-bellied whistling ducks out there, but there's also a pair of fulvous whistling ducks that just came flying in. And apparently they roost here overnight before they make their forays out. And here, when it's not the breeding season in the wintertime, sometimes they will form these large aggregations. They're making use of a lake, a nice roosting site, a lot of trees, and just taking advantage of the things that human beings have done in the landscape here. A real survivor. The black-bellied whistling ducks are sometimes also called black-bellied tree ducks. If you look right behind me there, up in the trees, you'll see ducks flying into and out of the trees. We don't think about ducks using perches, and you could not mistake that tropical duck for any other species in North America, because those bright, weird orangish red bills and legs and feet and the black, brown, and white markings are truly distinctive among our ducks, and they spend a lot of time perched. I've even seen these right along streams in rainforests, perched way up high in the trees. An incredible tropical duck that's actually doing very well. It used to be restricted to just the lower Rio Grande Valley, but it's expanded its range, its breeding range, all the way up into places like South Carolina today. And as we've changed the habitat here, as we've gotten rid of a lot of the forests, the thickets, the thorn scrub, and the taller trees that are located along resacas and along the Rio Grande itself and other bodies of water, these birds have tried to survive by moving out, moving north. And today, they're much more common outside of the Rio Grande Valley than they are within the Rio Grande Valley. Well, the other species of whistling duck here, the fulvous whistling duck, is really not that closely related to the blackbellied. They're both called whistling ducks because of that incessant, high-pitched whistling that they're doing back there. When you look at these two species interacting, you kind of get the feeling that the fulvous whistling duck and the blackbellied whistling duck wouldn't really like to share the same territory. We've actually seen the fulvous out here being bullied. The fulvous whistling duck breeds in rice paddies. And so as the rice industry and agriculture, especially wetland agriculture, has extended and expanded in places like Louisiana and eastern Texas, this bird has extended its range from the heart of its range in the tropics, far outside of the lower Rio Grande Valley and all the way up into the Gulf Coast states. So just kind of really neat to see our two specialist tropical birds making use of a habitat that you just wouldn't expect. It isn't just the saltwater habitats that are incredibly important to migratory waterfowl here in Texas. Freshwater wetlands like this one here at Estero Llano Grande State Park are incredibly important to a huge number of migratory waterfowl in North America. The species that we're looking at right here are great examples of that. A few of the ducks that are out there behind me right now are gadwall. They're the rather plain ducks, especially when you're viewing them from afar, but the majority of the gadwall in the United States depend upon Texas for their winter migratory habitat. And gadwall really aren't as plain as they look from afar. If you get a pair of binoculars on them or you get up close, you're gonna see that they are incredibly intricately patterned on those feathers, especially the breast feathers of the male are just exquisite when you get a really close look at them. The females, well, they do look like a female mallard. They're not the most beautiful waterfowl, but an incredibly elegant bird. But the ones that are patterned like mallards out here with a little more white on them and an incredibly large flattened bill, those are shovelers, northern shovelers. And shovelers really easy to identify because of that big flat bill. That's where they get the name from. And those bills are built to strain tiny organisms and seeds from the water. In fact, it takes the smallest bits of food of any of the dabbling ducks that are out there. And because of that, it often feeds in shallow water, sometimes stagnant water. So one of the issues that this bird has is botulism toxicity from feeding in stagnant waters during bad years up in the north. So we see populations of those fluctuate wildly. And it's just really cool to get this close to a lot of these species because you usually can't do that. In most places, they're used to getting shot at, and they're not as confiding as these birds are here in the state park. Also out here, we have some much smaller ducks, and those are one of the most beautifully colored of any in North America and the smallest of the migratory waterfowl we have here. Those are green-winged teal. It's hard to see how they get their name until they show you that green spot on their wing. And right now, the female out there is getting us a really good look at that green spot. Another beautiful species that's out here in smaller numbers is a ring-necked duck. And when you look at them, they're really distinctive. Bright white ring around the bill, you'd think they'd be called ring-billed ducks. They're named ring-necked ducks because they actually have a little chestnut collar around the neck. Most of these species out here are migratory. They've come a long way, some from as far away as northern Canada to be here in South Texas. And the neat part about these wetlands and about South Texas is that it connects the continent. This place may not be on your mind in terms of important wildlife habitat, but no matter where you live in the United States, something relies on Texas part of the year.
Estero Llano Grande provides habitat for much more than just waterfowl. This is the most reliable place to see one of the best camouflaged birds in America.
Why in the world would I be staring into this brush pile? You have to take a really close look. This animal is incredibly well camouflaged. That's a common Parakee. Parakee is a name that is probably derived from the Spanish Parakee. And that is what we call an onomatopoeic name. It's something that is mimicking the sound that this bird makes. It's one of the most common sounds that you hear in Central and South America during the night. Well, this animal is a nightjar. It's related to whippoorwills, porwills, chuckwills, widows, and nighthawks. And you never get a chance to see those other birds up close and personal like these. I mean, it's a very rare event to see one of those in the daytime. But they all have one thing in common. They tend to be cryptic. These are nocturnal birds that are colored just like the substrate that they spend their days sleeping in. And that's exactly what this bird is doing. They have what appears to be a little tiny beak. The beak is really short, but when it opens up its mouth to preen, you realize that the vibrissae, all those little bristles in the feathers, are covering up a large part of the mouth of this creature. And that big gaping mouth is there to capture insects. This animal hunts in a very different way than a nighthawk. It's not flying around all the time. They actually just sort of walk around the ground and make short hops up, fluttering their wings. They look like an injured bird, but what they're doing is they're hopping up off the ground to capture flying insects on the wing. An incredibly cool bird. And just like most of these birds, that one, a non-migrant, extending its range, even though it's very common in the tropics, only to this little tiny corner of South Texas here in the United States.
Perhaps the most famous winter resident of South Texas is found in and around Port Aransas. We arrived too late in the afternoon for cranes, but just in time for quite a show in the marsh.
We've been having way too much fun here in Port Aransas. We're at this beautiful little birding center right in the middle of town. And on one side, open water, completely full of ducks. Just about every species that would be in a freshwater wetland like this. Mm-hmm. I know Katie's been enthralled with this little guy.
The pied-billed grebe, not only is it really cute, it's doing all this diving in and out of the water, and I guess it's looking for food like crustaceans and fish.
Fish, yeah. It's a very common species, but one that's really, it's hard not to like that bird. But what's really amazing is on this side, in the actual cattail marsh, sometimes if you just sit still, life comes to you. Mm-hmm. And so some of my favorite birds are the songbirds that come out that are specialists of these wetlands, and we've had the best looks at common yellowthroats and marsh wrens here. Birds that are really skulking and you usually don't get a good look at, but also soras.
Yeah, that was my first sora that I've seen, and it was blending in really, really well, so you could see it for a second and then disappeared.
Right, and soras are a type of rail, and they're highly migratory. So once again, even this habitat is providing habitat for these long-distance migrants that have been coming through here. But then not only that, but green herons in here, which again, cryptically colored, camouflage, but also bitterns.
The bittern, the American bittern, right?
Right, American bittern and the least bittern. And least bitterns are normally migrating out of this area, but each year a few stick around here in South Texas, even up in South Carolina, some years we get a few. But mostly we think of that as being a bird that migrates way to the south and then is here to breed. But then the American bittern,
wow.
We spent a long, long time watching them.
We were sitting there watching the American bittern, and it had its own cheering section. It was trying to fish and hunt, and we were cheering it on, hoping that it would catch something.
Finally did. A really cool cryptic creature that comes up and bobs near the water, looking like swaying reeds and hard to see unless it really comes out in the open. And just incredible group of animals, and then it's hard to miss probably the best thing we saw.
The best thing we saw was a group of nutria, and they were eating, they were searching for food, diving in and out of the water, stumbling in and out of the reeds.
And two males meeting each other and
that's what we think.
Not liking each other.
Oh, they did not like each other. There was a standoff.
And right, standoff pretty much. Just in a standoff. And that's a really kind of interesting animal because it's actually an invasive exotic here. It's an herbivore. It's out here consuming roots and vegetation. Not very cryptic, pretty clumsy, but something that's really taken over these wetlands, and it belongs in southern South America.
Yeah, that was the first comment I made was, oh, it looks like a capybara, and
actually
it kind of was. They're related.
So, next time you're looking at ducks, take a look on the other side of the boardwalk, because some really cool stuff goes on there too.
A last chilly morning in Texas provides us with the perfect opportunity to see the cranes. I've seen these many times, but this is Katie's first experience.
This is absolutely breathtaking. When I first saw these cranes, I just started jumping up and down. It's that feeling when your heart starts beating really fast and you get so super excited because you're seeing something that you read about and you talk about. The birds behind me are whooping cranes, and they are one of the rarest crane species and one of the most rare birds in the United States, in North America really. These whooping cranes are part of the Aransas wood buffalo population. There's only about 280 cranes in this flock. They spend part of the year in Canada at the Wood Buffalo National Park, and then they migrate to this rich, abundant habitat here in Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. It's not an innate thing that they're born with. They learn this migration route from their parents, and they make this trip every single year. Whooping cranes are an endangered species, and right now this is the only self-sustaining wild population anywhere. This is it. There are other populations of whooping cranes found in the United States, but they're captive reared or they're non-migratory. And in 1941, there were only 15 cranes, and they were here in Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. This endangered species is today on its way to recovery. Those 15 cranes have become a population of about 600 cranes, and it's because of intense conservation efforts. Every bit of land between Canada all the way down here to Texas is critical to their survival. These birds travel 2,500 miles for their seafood buffet of blue crabs. It's been noted that these guys can eat up to 80 crabs in one day. Talk about all you can eat, right? This is a really important food source for them, and it provides energy so they can make that migration back up north and start their nesting season. The habitat here that we're in Aransas is extremely important for the blue crabs to survive. So the quality of the habitat and the quality of the water is really important to the whooping cranes because that's where they're going to find the most blue crabs. Whooping cranes have faced down some pretty big hurdles throughout their history, but there's still some threats that remain. The habitat loss, human development, a late hurricane coming through this area could really decimate the numbers in this population. Other threats that they face are drought, oil spills, chemical spills. These guys live right on the shipping lanes to and from oil refineries here in Texas. Now, conservation efforts have been intensive. We've got scientists and researchers, volunteers from all over working together. And one thing that we need to keep in mind is we need to preserve their habitat, which is our habitat too.
This expedition to southern Texas has just been astounding. I never thought we'd see so many different kinds of plants and animals in such a short period of time. And it really goes to show you just how immense the biodiversity of this little corner of America is. Some of the species have adapted to and even benefited from the activities of man here, but others are really struggling to maintain a foothold here in America. With any luck and a lot of hard work, species like the ocelot, the green jay, and the Plain Chachalaka will continue to delight visitors and residents for generations to come. I'm Patrick McMillan, wishing you your own exciting expedition.